Hey, Steve Teles.
Hi, Glenn Loury.
How are you?
We should. I'm doing fine. I'm here in not so sunny Baltimore, Maryland, at Johns Hopkins University, where I'm associate professor of political science.
Extraordinaire, I would have said.
Extraordinaire. I think actually that was I required that to be formally in my title.
It ought to be. It ought to be. And this is Glenn Loury, your Blogging Heads faithful, here in sunny. No, not really. Providence, Rhode Island.
Right.
You know, we're ready to go. So, what are we talking about today, Steve?
Well, this is the special Blogging Heads navel-gazing, pretentious episode, which is going to be on. I tried to come up with the most pretentious possible title for our conversation, and the one I came up with was the role of intellectuals in the Obama era, which I think will at least put in the top 10 of most pretentious titles of a Blogging Heads.
Exactly. I think I'm thankful now for editors at bloggingheads.tv. They will undoubtedly fashion a more artful title than that.
Yes, well, that's their that's what they paid them the big bucks for.
Exactly.
So.
Intellectuals, yeah. Well, we're one of those.
Well, on alternative days, we're intellectuals. You certainly are an intellectual. I'm merely a professor and a hack on alternate days.
Yeah.
And so I think the theme today partially is on the tensions between roles that intellectuals have. Often, there's an idea that intellectuals' role where politics is concerned is to speak truth to power, that their role is to be simply sort of transparently communicating what they believe is either the facts or the normative or moral truth of a particular issue. And one of the things I think that we are going to get into is that intellectuals also have roles. They have roles that are particular to particular identities, and that sometimes those are in tension with the pure truth-speaking idea that we often associate with intellectuals, and some of those may actually be of particular concern in this Obama era, which introduces some complexities or tensions into particular roles that intellectuals have. And the one I wanted to start out with is the role of the black intellectual, obviously more of a pressing concern for you than for me. With 96% of black Americans voting for Obama, you might think that there's pressure to be on the team if you're a black intellectual.
Yeah, you just might think that.
Yeah, you've been getting emails to that effect, Glenn?
Well, and comments from people and subtle kinds of pressure. I mean, from some people I respect very much, who are basically saying, come on and get with it and all of that. But I don't know. I mean, I think the racial thing is, if you're a serious intellectual, how much weight could you put on that? You know what I mean? I mean, it's not very important at the end of the day, it seems to me. I think that's a very hard case to make, that because you're black, you're obliged to think this or that. Something about blackness compels a particular thought. It's a very dangerous anti-intellectual posture. So, I feel pressures, but I try not to take them too seriously.
Right. I mean, I guess though, in that sense, you're saying that it's not a very serious approach for an intellectual is itself a choice, right? That is, people make choices about how important to make their racial identity to their intellectual life, right? So there are plenty of black intellectuals who think that the black is not a trivial modifier to their being intellectual, right?
No, I agree. Such people exist, and I'm saying to the extent that they allow their race to be a driving factor in their thinking, I don't take them very seriously as intellectuals. No doubt they exist. I'm not denying that. But I think they discredit themselves to some degree. We could name names here. By adopting a certain posture and being a kind of... I'll give you an example. So during the campaign, or just after, I heard a leading figure in the print media praise by name certain African-American journalists for having kept their heads and been very cool throughout the campaign when they must have been feeling such passions for the first African-American to be elected. And I thought, what a discrediting thing to have said about your profession, that it was an exceptional achievement. First of all, I doubted the fact of it. I mean, the people who were named, Gene Robinson at the Washington Post, Bob Herbert at the New York Times, were anything but cool and level-headed through the campaign, if you ask me. But that's neither here nor there.
Right.
The idea that it was to your credit to have not allowed the passions of a man of your ethnicity running for president to have overwhelmed your journalistic judgment. What does that say about the typical, holder of one of these important positions? It seems to me to not redound much at all to their credit.
Well, I mean, what you're sort of pointing to there is the idea that at least where you have a profession that is a role that has a pretty defined set of expectations, that that racial identity may be in conflict or in tension with that. But isn't the role of a sort of public intellectual less defined in that sense? I mean, a journalist, there's all these codes as to what a good journalist does, right? Aspects of objectivity, of covering both sides. But does that really apply to other kinds of intellectuals? That not, journalists aren't really public intellectuals as we often think of them as. And in part, I mean, certainly one role people think of themselves is that their role is to communicate something about the position of a larger collectivity to the public.
Yes.
The idea that they're not just sort of, marginalized, unmarked, unidentified people in the sense that they're Catholic intellectuals. You wouldn't say that somebody being a Catholic intellectual, that their Catholicness was somehow irrelevant, would you?
No, I wouldn't, and I'm probably taking the position, too strongly, maybe just to sharpen this discussion. But I guess what I want to say is that a genuine intellectual, if you let me say that, ought to be uncomfortable with that aspect, with a kind of ethnic, racial, religious, a kind of identity, wearing it too heavily. It's something to be fought against, I think. It's something, you mark out, it's there, but it's the enemy of your true vocation, if you elect to, the life of the mind. That kind of thing is the enemy of probing, of questioning, and of getting to the bottom of things. It's just too easy. It's just too easy a role to play. Oh, I'm the black guy. I know what I'm supposed to say now.
Right.
Something like that.
So I guess the thing that I was thinking of is that part of what you're pointing to is that a good intellectual's always got tension, right? I mean, the aspect of what makes someone, I think, an interesting intellectual isn't that they don't have any identities, right? They're not, that they've totally freed themselves for their Catholicness or their race or their ideology, but that they're constantly sort of aware of it. What I think really makes them an intellectual is a high level of self-consciousness, right? I think it's Hegel who said that, philosophy was thought that had become conscious of itself. And in a way, that's why I think being a public intellectual is about, right? It's not about not having any identity, but it's about being aware of that identity and being, in some sense, worried about its effect on the underlying set of ideas that you have, or what you're actually saying. In some sense, claiming to be a black intellectual is in part a kind of power move, right? It's a way of claiming authority in a particular area. So you're saying that it's not the fact of having an identity, but it's making a claim of authority on others on the basis of that identity that's somehow anti-intellectual.
Well, I think that's certainly one thing that's anti-intellectual, that, I'm somehow an insider, that either my moral weight or my, purchase on truth is greater in virtue of the fact that I am of this group. So that's kind of one thing. But I think there's another thing, too, which is a narrowing of the agenda and a kind of dulling of the critical edge. So, a black or African-American intellectual who's incapable of looking in a clear-eyed fashion at, social dysfunction in the African-American community, or who worries that to carry the analysis so far in public will give aid and comfort to, outsiders, or will malign the group. We shouldn't be talking about that. Or a Jewish intellectual who can't separate the loyalty that they might feel to their group's historical project from a capacity to analyze and critically assess the moral and moral dimensions of the problems in the Middle East or whatever it might be. I mean, these are all, it seems to me, failures, intellectual failures, insofar as they impede the critical function. I mean, speaking truth to power, I think, is part of the job description, and that means not only the powers in the state, but it also means the, quote, powers of social opinion and conformity that might reign within one's own within one's own ethnic or racial or religious group.
Well, that's an interesting transition, I think, to thinking about the role of conservative intellectuals, something that you used to be in a previous life when we first met each other. We met as you as a conservative intellectual. And
you had to say that, didn't you?
I did have to get it out there. I've outed you, Glenn. Now you'll, it's not like this was a great state secret or anything.
Yeah.
But one of the things that interested me during the campaign was that there were a number of these conservative intellectuals who criticized the McCain campaign, especially criticized the Palin pick. And part of it, I think there was a bunch of things going on in what they were doing. People like Chris Buckley or David Frum or Ross Douthat. There was a huge number of conservative intellectuals who showered a lot of disregard on the Palin pick. But a number of conservatives in the movement, you noticed, had very sharp words for these people like Jonah Goldberg. And I think part of what was going on was that they were claiming that these conservative intellectuals who were criticizing McCain, criticizing the Republicans, criticizing other conservatives, were in a way exploiting a shared identity. That is, the conservative movement had invested something in these people like Ross Douthat and these other ones, and that they only were who they were. They only had the status they had. They were only interesting to the media to the degree to which they had a identity that someone else had helped create for them.
And so they were being disloyal in some way by...
Not just, in part I think being disloyal, but I think they weren't being conscious of the fact that they were being used. I think that was the most important part of the argument. And you saw that, for example, there was this famous Rachel Maddow episode where David Frum was on. At some point in the beginning of the interview, David Frum realized that Rachel Maddow was using her to do something in particular. That Rachel Maddow wanted to make an argument about the Republicans, and that Frum was really being used by her because he was the one who would say, well, even conservatives like David Frum would admit that would say that this is the case.
Yeah, no, I can relate to this very well because. In the racial arena, the discussion of racial policy, going back some years when I was a black conservative, this was definitely one of the things that was going on I came to see, which is that, it's the even some blacks are criticizing affirmative action. Even some blacks can see that Jesse Jackson's runs for the president are not very serious. Even some blacks know that Louis Farrakhan is a dangerous man, etc. When I would be asked by, I don't know, Bill O'Reilly or somebody, to come on and spout off about something that I may have written a piece on, being very critical of the black orthodoxy, I, in due course became aware of the fact that the main thing that was going on there was not the content or quality of my argument, but it was the even some blacks are saying phenomenon. I was being exhibited as a piece of evidence in somebody else's argument, for which my arguments had less significance than, my racial and political, the combination of my racial and political identities. So, I think I think you put your finger on something that is out there, and I guess now your question is going to be, what's the self-respecting intellectual to do in such a circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, how do you? I mean, again, when you go back to the From interview, and clearly, I mean, the thing that I think made that such an, and we'll try and link to this on the side here. What I think made that such an interesting thing was that From was clearly aware of that, right? He was clearly aware of it and was trying to find some way both to say the thing that he believed to be true, right? I mean, what makes that sort of dynamic, which you wrote about, and we'll also link to that article. What makes that dynamic so interesting is that the person who's being used, right, being used by somebody else because of their status, right, actually believes the thing they're saying, right? That is, if they were just saying something that they didn't believe in order to, get on TV, that would make it a much less interesting problem, right? But to the degree to which the person is saying something that they actually believe and they think needs to be said at a particular time, they have to, simultaneously do that part of speaking truth to power while also trying to neutralize the fact that somebody else is using them for a project that they don't agree with. That is, how can somebody do both of those things simultaneously? Is it simply a matter of saying it only internally, that is, making the critique within your group, but not doing it in the context of the other side? Or, how can an intellectual balance those two imperatives?
Yeah, it may be impossible to balance them in some circumstances, and I think that's just the way it is. And so there's a kind of failure in the marketplace of ideas here. I'm trying to think of another good example of this. That's not.
Well, again, one position I think is, and again, some conservatives said it is, we all know that David Frum or these other guys are right, but you don't wash your dirty laundry in public, right? So they have an obligation to say these things, but you're supposed to have a certain degree of etiquette. I think would be the only word. That is, a proper intellectual who's actually embedded in some community that made an investment in him has a kind of obligation to that community to at least try to make this act of persuasion internally before you go and try and then again wash your dirty laundry in public. Do you think that, because again, just the pure idea of speaking truth to power implies no kind of strategic awareness, but do you think that intellectuals actually have an obligation to exercise that strategic awareness rather than just a sort of naive truth-telling?
I don't know, but I think that one can be too clever by half here, and the law of unintended consequences and all of that, and that it's really impossible to do all these calculations, all these political calculations that you're supposed to be doing while you're strategically figuring out how the truth that you think you know, which you are or are not prepared to say, will redound in one way or the other. I think it's very hard for people to know what that's going to be. So, and also this thing about washing dirty linen in public and making the argument internal and all of that. I mean, often, or maybe most of the time, there isn't any space for that kind of internal argumentation. I mean, how would African Americans have a private conversation about anything? It's just simply impossible. And I'm not sure I know how conservatives can have it entirely, conservatives as such, can have a private conversation. I mean, groups of conservatives can get together and they can, put their heads together and try to sort something out. But if someone has been nominated to be Vice President of the United States, whom you firmly believe it's appalling that they would be placed so close to the seat of power in this country, given the thinness of their resume and the lack of their experience, and that's what you believe, you're going to have that internal argument? I mean, you got to stop the train before it leaves the station, or whatever the right metaphor is.
Right, but in this case, though, I think the problem is a little more difficult, right? Because in the case of Palin, the train had left the station.
Yeah. Right?
I mean, that is, if you can make an argument beforehand and you can say, oh, this is a bad idea, and she's not prepared, or she's an embarrassment to the movement, and you can stop something from happening. But again, I think the argument of the sort of anti-reformer wing, or whatever we're calling it in the conservatives, was that this was already happening, right? This was a fact. You couldn't undo the Palin pick, right? If you did it, it would simply destroy the McCain campaign, and therefore you had a fact on the ground, right? It wasn't.
I'd rather lose an election than lose a war. You know,
Right.
I'd rather see McCain go down than have somebody who I think really is unfit in a position of power. I mean,
Right.
wouldn't that be the argument? I mean, you know.
Well, but again, I think that, if you're a conservative, then lots of them said, look, many of them said, well, we know Palin's a lousy pick, but Jesus, this Obama guy is really bad, right? That is as bad as Palin is, he's not going to be anywhere as bad for the things we care about as Palin is, and therefore there's an inevitable strategic element of speech. That, if you're speaking, you're speaking to an audience, right? You're not just trying to make a statement for the record, right? You're trying to engage in an act of persuasion. You're trying to make things happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Did you see Stanley Fish's new book? And he's also, in his New York Times blog, had some pieces on how basically universities shouldn't be political.
Yeah.
Save the world on your own time, I think that's what he calls the book.
Right. No, clearly, I think his argument is...
Well, what I want to say is, okay, I want to hear what you have to say about Stanley Fish. I just want to say this, that I'm thinking of an, quote, intellectual, close quote, like that. That is to say that what your function is thinking and argument, not saving the world,
Right.
Not furthering a political program. I mean, to the extent that you're doing that, you're not functioning, with integrity as an intellectual. Something like, maybe this argument doesn't hold together, but anyway, what were you going to say?
Well, as I understand the Fish argument, right, it's really about, in some sense, one way to think about it is it's the difference between what you do on campus and what you do off campus, right? His is really, I think, about what you do when you're in the classroom, right? That that at least professors, right, have a vocation that requires that when they're in the classroom to speak out of a set of professional norms or beliefs or ideas, and that space is supposed to be insulated from these kind of strategic considerations. You're not supposed to be thinking of your students as people to engage in crafted speech to, right? And I think that's right. That has to be right. Anybody who really is a serious teacher, I think, knows that when they go in the classroom that they're engaged in a particular role, and that role, is in part to simply, deepen the complexity of ideas of their students, to make them more thoughtful, to pass along a body of knowledge. Yeah. It's a collective body of knowledge, not just your personal body of knowledge. But I don't think that in any way means that when you get off of campus, you're not supposed to be aware of the fact that an audience is observing your speaking, right? And that, again, these are acts of persuasion. When you write an op-ed in the Washington Post or the New York Times, you're writing it because you expect others will respond to it in a particular way. Right?
No, I got that. But I'm trying to see what follows from that. Yes, it's true. We live in the real world, and there are, you can be more or less effective in your task of persuasion, depending on how you present yourself and frame your argument. Yes, framing of argument matters. Okay, I see all of that, but I don't know how deeply that goes. That's a kind of common sense observation, but does it reframe the task here in some fundamental way? Go ahead.
Well, let me go. Okay, if you want to get fundamental on me, one way to think about this is
Persecution in the Art of Writing. Okay, Leo Strauss,
you beat
right?
me to it. You out-Straussed me, right? Strauss's argument.
Well, I used to hang around Straussians. That's part of my intellectual identity.
Well, I was trained by Straussians, which someone once said was like being raised by wolves. But some of my best friends, etc. But the argument of Strauss in Persecution in the Art of Writing and some of his other writings was that intellectuals, have an obligation in some cases not to say all that they believe, because there are people observing it. There will be an effect. In the case of Strauss, it's really religion that's the most important example of that. Yeah. That is that many intellectuals or philosophers know that the truths that their tribe draws on are at least partial, if not totally artificial, right? But they also are aware that those beliefs are part of what makes their tribe capable of operating. That actually gives individual people's lives meaning, right? And that undermining those ideas, undermining those things that ordinary people believe, will lead to nihilism rather than to some other set of ideas.
So goes the argument.
Right, so that clearly, Strauss's argument clearly. Let me just finish. I mean, Strauss's argument clearly was a call for a kind of strategic, active speech. Right, that's what he meant by the art of writing. The art of writing was to write in such a way that other philosophers would understand.
That's where I was going. I mean, at the end of the day, he's saying, yes, you have to be strategic, but you still tell the truth. You just tell it in a way that is. It's a kind of double. It's communicating to multiple audiences at the same time. It's speaking out of both sides of your mouth. It's writing between the lines, something like that, right? But you're still writing between those lines,
right? But again, I think your argument is that you can get too mixed up, and you can get once you start thinking about all these strategic considerations, that you start losing your vocation as an intellectual. But if you believe Strauss's argument that strategic thinking is inseparable for the act of being an intellectual, right? That is, it's impossible simply to engage in the enterprise of being intellectual in a purely naive way without trying to think about how your act of speech would actually impact the world. And his example was religion, but I don't see why that doesn't apply in other cases, that same degree of strategic consideration should apply to other kind of audiences that'll be watching and observing your active speaking.
Okay, I want to concede the point that strategy is in the mix and it's unavoidable. But what I want to say is that sometimes there are questions, and maybe this is when the intellectual function or intellectual vocation is most vitally important, where getting the right answer is all that matters. I mean, and where it can be so... The kind of consensus, widely accepted theology of the time can be so stultifying, so heavy on clear thinking that one simply has to break out of it. So I don't know. East European dissidents before 1989. I mean, there can be no doubt that one had to be calculating and strategic in how it is that one made arguments because the powers of the state would come down on you. And there can be no doubt that most people were walking around mouthing, inanities. And yet, the critical argument, the emperor has no clothes argument, this is all phony. This is false. These are lies. The Václav Havel argument.
Right.
That had to be made. At some point there isn't any way around it. That's why a lot of these people end up in jail, right?
Right, but again, in the Havel argument, I think it's a case where almost everyone recognized that the state truths were not in fact true, right? I mean, that was a case where there was, everybody knew that, putting the, workers of all countries unite on the front of your store was a kind of lie, that people didn't really believe it, and therefore intellectuals had an obligation to be willing to be the person to be the sort of first mover, right? To be the first person to say, we all know this isn't true, and somebody has to say it so that all of us...
That's what I'm talking about.
Right, so all of us can kind of have what Havel or those kind of people were trying to do was create a kind of cascade of other people who would all say, yeah, we all know that's not true.
George Orwell in Socialist Britain.
Right. Yeah. And so, but again, I guess the question is that really the situation we're in now? I mean, I saw a little bit of that, I think, in, your previous blogging heads with Josh Cohen or others where, you were, I hate to also admit that, you were once a neoconservative and you also were once a Hillary Clinton supporter, and not that I think I'm enough of a Jeane Kirkpatrick person not to believe in that kind of equivalence, but these are not morally equivalent things to have.
I make no apologies for either of those things, frankly, but I have moved on.
But I saw part of that. I mean, and I know also you believe that Hillary was also the best candidate, obviously, but part of it.
Yeah, I think I might have been wrong about that.
Right,
but it was a sincere belief at the time.
Right. So, but part of it, when I saw those, is that I got a sense that you were repulsed by the theology. You were repulsed by the idea that people were trying to make Obama into this kind of secular saint of liberalism. And
correct.
There was something anti-intellectual about
deeply so in my
the
view.
Obama
yes.
cult as you saw it, and therefore, an intellectual, whether it was a black intellectual or a liberal intellectual, whatever it was, that kind of set of beliefs was in self inimical to clear thinking. Do you think that that's still out there? That as an intellectual, that part of one of the functions of intellectuals should be simply to remind people that this guy is a Paul like any other Paul, and that his his speaking and all these other things are simply ways to persuade people to go along with a political program that's like any other political program?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I don't, it's not over as far as I'm concerned. Obama watch begins, right, kind of thing, and I was, the drinking of the Kool-Aid is the metaphor, and I was appalled at the sycophancy and the kind of suspension of critical function and all that I saw going on, and this is Abraham Lincoln, right, this is Martin Luther King and JFK and one, all this kind of silly, what I thought was very silly. I mean, with due respect, I'm sorry, I don't mean any disrespect to President-elect Obama. I just mean to say that, he may or may not prove to be Abraham Lincoln. Who could possibly know that?
Right.
I mean, it seems an absurdity to use that kind of language, or rather, a kind of, marketing move that is very, very anti-intellectual in my opinion.
But,
it's all spin.
Right.
So.
Well, I guess the other thing I would say is though that marketing, right, is intended to be marketing for a political program that in many parts you actually agree with, right? That is that Obama, in part of the reason for creating that sort of halo around the man, right, is that people thought that halo would actually be effective for being able to pass things that otherwise hadn't been passed for 20 years, for healthcare reform or some sort of action on global warming, right? That's an actual property that this larger movement needed, right? I mean, I think a lot of liberal intellectuals thought that one of the problems is we didn't have someone who could communicate our beliefs, our ideas out to a broader public, who had that kind of charismatic authority, and that therefore there's a danger to puncturing that too much, isn't there?
Yeah, yes, but that danger should be set alongside the risk of the swoon, and the risk of the swoon and the myth making is you get.
What are you worried about specifically? I guess I'm trying to figure out.
Okay, here's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about, and I said this during the campaign. I said this when I was a Hillary Clinton supporter and whatnot. I'm saying, what are the Democrats about? What's the governing philosophy? If I pick up, Sean Wilentze's book on Reagan,
right?
It's clear from page 10 what Reagan was about. I mean, what the core, Morning in America, optimism, market fundamentalism, Cold Warrior, whatever. But it's very clear. It's very clear what he was about. And I want to know what the Democrats are about. I mean, so we had an argument with Reaganomics and with, conservatism, that is, we progressive, we liberals, we Democrats have an argument with them. We think that they were wrong. Wrong about what? About regulation, about taxes, about America's role in the world? Okay, well, what is our vision? Okay, let's be concrete about it. What are the values? What do they derive from? How do they relate to our history? And I felt like all of that was being sublimated to this to this goal of winning, and we weren't thinking our way through the thing. And so, what I'm afraid is that some really stupid stuff will get done.
Like, well, I guess the problem though I have with that, and I'm certainly not against thinking, obviously being an intellectual, but the concern I have is that the Democrats are actually a pretty highly cohesive party now, right? That is, it's not the reason that we weren't hashing out big, complicated, deep philosophical issues in the primaries that nobody disagreed, right? Nobody, there was differences at the margin on healthcare, and there's differences at the margin on exactly how you're going to deal with global warming. But, we've reached a point where the parties are pretty, significantly polarized, and their positions on issues are, have sort of settled into what they are. So I'm not exactly sure, I guess the only reason I can think that would be a concern is if you think that there's something in that orthodoxy that's become pretty settled on the liberal side that you think is problematic. Is there some big flaw or a big gap in that set of ideas that you think is going to end up hurting the Obama administration because there wasn't that kind of searching first principles discussion of what liberals believe in the primaries or earlier?
Yeah,
you
maybe.
See where I'm going with this? Right?
You know what I think about all this talk about regulation, re-regulation, and we need to grow the green sector of the economy. We're going to create green jobs. I mean, I heard Obama in a press conference say, jobs that I'm going to create during my administration. I know that's the way that politicians talk, but I think we all know that politicians don't create jobs. I mean, I'm sorry to sound like an old line conservative, but politicians don't create jobs, and I don't want my president running around talking about growing. Anyway, I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I'm actually.
But trade. What is the view about trade, about goods moving across borders? Unions. All right, restructuring of the automobile industry. The automobile industry is being restructured. I used to work in a printing plant in Chicago when I was in college. That's how I worked my way through college. The R.R. Donnelly and Sons, and they printed all the telephone books and the catalogs for Sears and the magazines, Life and Time and all of that. All of those jobs are gone. That factory is now a shopping mall. Okay, in 30 years, there was an adjustment. You don't print stuff in big cities in the Midwest anymore. You print it either in the south of the United States or you print it in offshore. And that's the way of the world. And so, and it's there's nothing wrong with that. I mean,
but I mean, I guess the issue is, how for you, how fundamental is that difference? Do you think that this is simply, that a kind of empirical mistake, or do you think that that some of the things you're criticizing are pretty close to the religion of the Democratic Party? That is, are these kind of things are these the kind of things that could be colossal mistakes of the kind that you need to sort of put yourself down on the tracks before they happen and say this is going to wreck your administration's program? Is it that fundamental? Is it the kind of thing that you need to sort of encourage a schism inside the party to make clear at a time when the administration is trying to pass a lot of pretty substantial stuff, and you may be giving again aid and comfort to the other side. That is, that's precisely what conservatives are now. The meme they're trying to spread is that we're all this is the road to serfdom, and liberals are about to sort of totally re-regulate the economy, and that's part of their argument against health care reform and other areas. Isn't that another case where there has to be at least some kind of strategic thinking in your mind? Because at the same time that and I think we both agree on more or less what you were just saying, right?
Yeah.
That that the idea that that we can somehow plan an entire green economy is nuts, right? I mean, I think the idea that we can somehow build a lot of public transportation. That's something that doesn't require an enormous amount of knowledge in the center, right? Those are good infrastructure programs that government knows how to run. We can increase the price of carbon.
Well, there you go. Now you're talking.
Right.
Now you're talking. I mean, we could increase the price of carbon. We could keep the price of gasoline up high. But with taxes, even as the market fluctuates, I mean, these are kind of things that one sees recommended in newspaper columns these days, so doesn't require a whole lot of imagination to think of these things, but I think they're fundamentally right. We could get out of the ethanol business. Right. Yeah, the list is very long. We could restructure our farm policy, which is an absurdity.
Right.
I'm not just blaming Democrats for this, don't get me wrong, but But
I guess the idea is, in some sense, what you're criticizing is a kind of return to a form of industrial policy, right? That the government's going to actively be out there trying to create an industry that didn't exist, that will be producing X number of jobs. And in part, I guess, what the thing that bothers me about that is I kind of thought we had this argument.
We had this argument 25 years ago.
Yeah, I remember, in grad school reading Arthur Oken, reading Charlie Schultz and those little Brookings, in those little Brookings books, right? And that argument was right.
Correct.
I think that the criticism
argument against industrial policy.
Yeah, that was a good argument.
And Bob Reich, by the way, my friend and former colleague Bob Reich was one of those arguing on the other side of that argument in those years.
And as I recall, Paul Krugman was one of the critics. I actually haven't seen Krugman using his platform to say, look, there's all these kind of interventions we ought to be doing in the economy, but here's the mistake that could conceivably really harm this administration. I guess that's where I see some of this, again, as a partisan, and I admit, even though I'm in my office, so maybe according to Stanley Fish, I shouldn't be making this argument from that point of view. But part of what I'm concerned of is that all these things that don't make a lot of sense, that are going to end up not working, in some sense being counterproductive, are going to also soak up space for things the government ought to be doing, right? That is, the government ought to be having a big carbon tax, not by the way, a cap and trade, which is going to be a disaster. I think that's another issue, right? What if the Obama administration puts forward a big cap and trade program, right? Now, I personally think that isn't going to work. That it's going to turn out to be a big bureaucratic mess, and it's going to turn out to be subject to enormous kind of public choice problems. But the alternative that I'm in favor of, which is a carbon tax, doesn't seem to be on the agenda. So objectively, in that sense, I'm just an anti-environmentalist, aren't I? Okay,
so no, you're not. I'm going to give Milton Friedman as my example. So I know you know his book Capitalism and Freedom, which everyone should know, which was written in the early 1960s, I think 1962 or something like that, in which proposes, among other things, a volunteer military force. Well, we got one. School choice. Well, it's a huge movement, and a lot of institutional change has happened as a consequence of it. A negative income tax. Well, the earned income tax credit comes pretty close.
Right.
A lot of stuff like that. Which was, completely out of the box at the time that he wrote those arguments. People thought it was just crazy, but, the power of ideas or something like that. I don't mean to get too sort of romantic and starry-eyed about it, but I just think being right has got a lot of strategic benefit as well as sort of moral integrity to it. Being right at the end of the day, and not getting... I don't know, like I say, too clever by half. Let me just stick with my knitting, the thing that I know about, and try to get that right, and not try to make all the calculations about how it's going to cut. Right.
Well, I guess one way to think about this is that there's a strategic value to integrity.
Well, yeah, there is that. You invest in the reputation for being a person of integrity, right?
Right. That is an excessive amount of being strategic on these things ends up getting you a reputation as being the kind of person who doesn't always speak, from some, sort of deep position, but is crafting their speech. And the other thing I think that
I like to think I've actually, in personal terms, earned that expectation from people to a certain degree just by being the contrarian that I've been.
Right.
You know?
But I guess one way to think about this is that it's also the case that where you've got unpopular opinions, and maybe this goes back to the Havel example, right? Part of the function of intellectuals, especially those who have some sort of sinecure like you have at Brown, right, who can't be fired, is to communicate to others that a particular position is capable of being held, right? That is where everybody else is saying one thing, right? Everyone's saying that, creating, having many, a million green jobs is the way of the future and what liberalism really is. That part of what you can do is you can communicate to people that there is actually some alternative, right? When I was in doing my interviews on my book, The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, there was the product placement. One thing that I heard from people, especially at places like Yale Law School or Harvard Law School, was there was such a uniformity of opinion that it mattered an enormous amount that one person was willing to sort of stand up and say no, right? Even if their argument wasn't totally cogent and they didn't have all the facts, the fact that one person was willing to go out there and say, there's some other position available. I think one thing that
this is the Federalist Society that you're talking about.
And part of it, I think part of the point. I think this is one of the reasons, though, why I think the model of the totally isolated intellectual doesn't really make sense, because often intellectuals need some sort of collectivity to do that, right? They need some group of people to huddle together with for warmth in order to sort of buck up their sort of sense of honor or their sense of pride that they can actually make these positions. And so in that sense, part of what intellectuals do is not just, make statements in their own name, right? But they also organize, right? They organize other people who agree with them. That certainly, Milton Friedman is a good example of that. You were using Friedman as an example of someone who simply went out there and sort of threw his ideas out to a world and then waited for the world to catch up to him. But I don't think that's at all the history of Milton Friedman. That certainly wasn't the history of Friedrich Hayek, right? That is, Hayek did, write these very powerful books, Constitutional Liberty. But the more I read about Hayek, the more I see him as a sort of global sort of organizer, right? In a period of Obama, maybe this is a proper statement to make, but Hayek was a profound organizer.
You're saying the Mont Pelerin Society?
Yeah, but not just the Mont Pelerin Society, right? He was involved. Certainly Mont Pelerin Society was part of his. He was out there trying to raise money from foundations.
Yeah,
he was out there trying to create a space for intellectuals who could, so that they knew that they didn't have to simply adapt to the existing orthodoxy.
So let me, because I think I'm going to be running short on time very soon. I wanted to just go back to talking about black intellectuals for a moment, if I may, because I think one of the present tasks of the black intellectual with integrity is to prepare for the end of race. The end of race. What? I think we need to be getting out of and I'm not just saying this because Obama, a man of mixed racial heritage, has been elected, or somehow his election constitutes the overcoming of all of the obstacles or something. This has been true for a long time, it seems to me, that there's something limiting, profoundly limiting, about this construction that we're building on top of the historical inheritance of race, this identity and systems of loyalty that we are creating and recreating on top of this historical legacy. And I just, I think it's got to be critiqued. Whenever I see Michael Eric Dyson, to name one black intellectual, or Cornel West, to name another, and I have some respect for Cornel. I don't think Michael is very impressive. This is just my personal opinion. Other people can disagree. But I'm just saying, whenever I see this unreflective marketing of race and kind of enactment of race. It's really a performance, performing race, right? I'm the black guy here. It even creeps into the use of the language. I mean, the tone of the voice. There's so many moves that are being made. And like you said earlier, they are claims of authority. They're claims of insider expertise. They are, I dare you to disagree with me kind of innuendo. I think, what a waste. I mean, what a waste of public airtime. And what a waste of intellectual potential firepower that is not being turned in the direction of thinking, if W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903 says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, I think he gets that one right, viewed particularly in global context, anti-colonialism and so on. But what is the 21st century? The 21st century is the globalization of all of these identities, The 21st century is definitely not about race, not in any way, shape, or form. It's a relic. So I mean, this, it seems to me, I don't know how this cuts vis-a-vis Democrat-Republican policy debates, but from the point of view of the intellectual health of people who descend from African heritage, of being able to think clearly about themselves. I mean, I give one example of this. I know I'm going on, but I'll just give one example. AfricanaDNA.com. That's a website. AfricanaDNA.com. Okay? Swab your cheek with a Q-tip, put it in an envelope, and mail it to somebody, and they will tell you what tribe your people in Africa, you are descended from.
Right.
Okay? Now, I understand why that might work as a product, why Oprah might want to talk about it on her program. Okay? But the intellectual problems associated with that modality of identity construction are huge. I mean, they're deep and interesting problems. They deserve to be seriously critiqued. A man like Anthony Appiah, the philosopher at Princeton, is engaged in the project of seriously critiquing them. That's an intellectual, or if you want, that's a black intellectual. But many other men and women are taking this almost infantile reflex about identity, and they're just riding the wave of it. They're not thinking at all. And some of them at Harvard, which is a really befuddling thing to me. But there you are.
So I guess the question, though, is what you're trying to do to say that the identity of blackness itself has sort of run out its use, right? Or is it that there's been a kind that people like Dyson or others or West have sort of have a version of blackness that is itself limiting, but that doesn't mean that the idea that there's a collectivity here, right? That has some collective interest. I mean, I think that would be the argument of people who would say that this isn't completely bankrupt, right? But there are however many black Americans in prison, and their race is not irrelevant to the fact of them being in prison, and that that there are actual, that there are highly segregated communities in inner cities that actually are groups, right? They're not groups just because we say they are or because we have a construction of them being a group, but they are actually groups. They're groups because they have collective interests, and therefore it doesn't seem to be irrelevant to say that there ought to be intellectuals who define themselves by the fact that they are attached to that problem. Right?
I know that argument, but I don't agree with it. I don't agree with it, Steve. I'm with the sociologist Rogers Brubaker. You know who I'm talking about, the UCLA sociologist who writes about ethnicity in Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe. But I mean, he says we take these groups too readily as givens in nature, and we fail to understand how the groupness is an achievement, how it's a produced outcome in the system to which journalists and intellectuals and politicians contribute mightily. And there are other ways of viewing the world. So the interest of these people in these prisons or in these housing projects or these inner city communities could be constructed as racial interest. And that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy to a certain degree. But there are many other ways that they could also be constructed, those interests. And whether or not they are objectively racial is, I think, a doubtful proposition. I mean, that they are objectively, inherently racial is a doubtful proposition. And it seems to me the evidence for this continues to mount. The boundaries between black and white have been rendered by the sheer force of demographic transition, of immigration, of intermarriage, of globalization. They've been rendered quaint.
Right, but I guess
historical relics, and yet people still walk around with this view of the world. And I think it needs to be critiqued by intellectuals.
Right. Well, but also it does seem, though, that part of the argument there, though, has to be that is an argument that even as you're making an argument against the priority of black identity, that has to be an argument that's being made to people who themselves view themselves as black. Right, that is, you're making an argument as someone with a particular identity to others that you actually have a shared identity with, right? To say we shouldn't actually prioritize this identity anymore, right? That seems like it has to be the way that an argument like that goes, is to say, look, we're both black, other people view us as black, but we shouldn't view that as important as we have over the last, however many decades, right? That is, we're part of a globalized society. We're part of other kinds of, we have class identities, we have ideological identities, right? Those all ought to be considered to be more important to us than the black identity. But again, I think this is the problem that I'm speaking to you out of.
Yeah.
Right? That is, you have to actually try and liquidate black identity through black identity, don't you? Right? That's what gives you the authority to make the argument, right? The reason why somebody like Ward Connerly can't really make that argument in a persuasive way is that his claims to black identity are problematic, right? The only reason that you can
I see the point you're making, and I think it's a subtle point. I see what you mean, that there's something inescapable in the social condition, even if at the end of the day my objective is to undermine the category, about kind of working from within it. And I see what you mean about persuasion, which is to say, by framing it as, look, I'm black, I'm as black as the next guy around, this is my background, this is what I've done with my life, but I tell you what, at the end of the day, here's how I see it, and here's how I think we, and the invocation of that, the use of that, that first person, right? That's an insider move. I'm on your side, I understand your anxieties, but listen to me, right? And I won't be listened to if I come at it as, in a less artful and less strategic way. So I concede that point, that there is embedded in the social situation some, constraints and imperatives associated with identity that, if one's to be effective in the intellectual function, one needs to take on board and be aware of.
Right, but I guess what I mean is the only thing that would cause anyone to be interested in your position as to whether black should actually step away from black identity is the fact that you're claiming to be an ex-race man, right? Yeah, that is, being an ex-race man is what allows you to argue that other people should be ex-race men, right? In a way that somebody, who didn't ever make that claim. And so, in that sense, I think this goes back to the point about whether you're speaking internally or speaking externally, right? That is, this is an argument that that in some sense, I think you have to think about where it is you make the argument, because where you make the argument does influence the degree to which other people are persuaded by it, right? That if you make the argument on Fox News, right, then people are going to think that, well, you're in some sense using your claim to authority.
I see all of that, and it's undoubtedly true. For my own part, I find the arguments much more interesting than the strategizing about how to frame and place the arguments. But I see what you're saying. If I go on Fox News and I say, look, it's the end of race over, it's time for black people to start thinking about themselves in different terms, that will be understood to mean something quite different from what I might have intended it to mean. And if I want to communicate, I have to take that on board. But okay, so those are the constraints of effective communication, but they're not the same thing as thinking something through. No,
but again, I think that's the point that I would make is that, and again, I think this goes back to, say, as all things, maybe go back to Strauss, right? Which is an intellectual simultaneously has to, and again, the ultimate vocation of the intellectual is not to be strategic, right? The ultimate intellectual is to say what he believes to be true, and that to prioritize strategy, I mean, I prioritize strategy because it's what I study, right? I study the strategic acts of intellectuals. But that isn't to say that that's the most important thing that intellectuals do, right? But that intellectuals have to be aware that that the meaning of their speech acts is connected to the context in which they occur, and therefore if speech is communication, if being an intellectual is about communicating, right? It's both about getting the idea right, but also making sure that the meaning of your speech is in fact what you intended to be. Anyway, so we're right up against an hour now.
Yeah,
we should probably be wrapping up.
Well, I was just going to say that amongst the identities that I feel obliged to respect is my professional identity as an economist, and there I think it's this is a social science, and there's it's quite orthogonal to, it's independent of, or largely independent of, mostly independent of,
right,
racial or even political, right? I mean, it's like what would be a physicist's who is of this or that origin or this or that faction. What would be the imperative for the doing of or talking about physics that arises from their social or ethnic or political identity? Well, you would hope very little at all. And while economics is not physics, as we know very well today, because it intersects with the world in a way that is very immediate, and there's an ideological component, and there's justification and legitimation functions that are going on in society, which are not scientific, but which are a part of the mix.
Right.
Nevertheless, there is something about that is that ought to be liberating. It ought to be in this world. The imperatives are to think the thing through and to get it right, come what may, something like that. But that's more than we can,
right. Well, maybe the subject of the role of policy intellectuals and the relationship between economic knowledge and partisan identities may be something we'll go on to in a future conversation. But I think right now we should wrap it up, so not to tax the capacities for concentration of our otherwise very intelligent audience there in Blogging Heads. I just want to thank you for spending the last hour with me. Again, this is Steve Teles signing off from the New America Foundation and Johns Hopkins University.
All right, Steve. Good to be with you.
All right, talk to you later, Glenn.
This is Glenn Loury. I'm at Brown University in Providence. And see you next time, Steve. We'll actually see you tomorrow, but that's another story.
Okay, see you tomorrow, Glenn.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.